little fox.
Superstars in history. Martin Luther King Jr. Hello! Welcome back to Superstars in History, the talk show that features famous people from the past. I'm your host, Famos, and I've had a dream about interviewing today's guest ever since I launched this show. A pastor, civil rights leader, and powerful speaker, this man changed history with peaceful protests and stirring speeches. Please join me in welcoming a personal hero, Martin Luther King Jr.
Thank you, Faye.
Let's get started, Dr. King. You were born on January 15th, 1929, in Atlanta, Georgia. Did you have a happy childhood?
Indeed, I did, thanks to two marvelous parents who filled our home with love. My father was a pastor at Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta, so I grew up listening to his sermons and witnessing firsthand the power of words to move and inspire people. Meanwhile, my mother taught me that everyone is worthy. Nobody is inferior to anyone else.
Those were probably important lessons, since you grew up in the segregated South.
Yes, it wasn't an easy place for a black child to grow up. Slavery was abolished when the Civil War ended in 1865, but African Americans still weren't treated equally, especially in the South. There were laws that made all kinds of racial discrimination legal, and segregation was everywhere. Restaurants, movie theaters, beaches, parks. I couldn't swim in a city pool or drink from certain water fountains. When I was 6 years old, a white playmate I had known forever suddenly wouldn't play with me anymore because he was starting at a white school. Not even children's schools were outside the bondage of segregation.
When you were 14, you won a prize for writing a speech about segregation.
Yes, I'm proud of that award. But the occasion was marred by what happened on the trip home. The bus driver made my teacher and me give up our seats to white passengers. We had to stand in the aisle for 90 miles. That was the angriest I ever was during my lifetime.
How awful! Did you go to college after high school?
I graduated high school at 15 and then attended a black college. I decided to become a minister like my father, so I went to a seminary in the North after college and eventually earned a PhD. During my studies, I became fascinated by Mohandas Gandhi, the activist in India who advocated nonviolent protest as a way to reform society. I began incorporating Gandhi's ideas into my approach to fighting for civil rights.
In 1954, you moved to Alabama with your wife. After living in the integrated North, why did you want to return to the segregated South?
Well, I was hired to serve as the pastor at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, and I had a hope I could fight segregation in my position. The following year, I did indeed help to lead a large protest in Montgomery.
Oh, you're talking about the Montgomery Bus Boycott. After Rosa Parks was arrested for refusing to give up her seat to a white person, African Americans boycotted the city buses for over a year.
We met at my church to organize the boycott, and I served as a spokesperson. It was exciting to be involved in the movement, but also dangerous. I received death threats, and one night while I was out at a meeting, my home was bombed.
Oh no! Was anyone hurt?
Fortunately, no. In November 1956, the boycott finally ended when the Supreme Court ruled that segregated bus laws were unconstitutional. We'd won a victory, Faye, but there was more work to be done. I traveled around the country supporting folks in other boycotts and speaking about nonviolent protest.
Speaking of nonviolent protest, you participated in many sit-ins at lunch counters. What can you tell us about them?
In the 60s, students began holding sit-ins at lunch counters where only white people were served. They'd sit down and quietly demand service. White people sometimes threw food or taunted them, but the protesters just sat there in silence. Those students were a glowing example of nonviolent protest.
You got arrested at a sit-in or march, right?
Yes. By then I had moved back to Atlanta to serve as a co-pastor at Ebenezer Baptist Church. In 1963, I traveled to Birmingham, Alabama, where black folks were staging sit-ins and marches. When I was arrested after joining the protest, I wrote a letter from my jail cell that described our philosophy of nonviolence. I felt I had to write the letter. White ministers were calling us lawbreakers. I wanted to explain that nonviolence is a powerful and just weapon. It draws attention to injustices.
Your letter from jail is really famous, but it's probably not as famous as your I Have a Dream speech. When did you make that speech?
Back in August 1963, I helped to organize the March for Jobs and Freedom, which attracted over 250,000 people to Washington, D.C. We were marching for equality for all people regardless of race or gender. Most folks remember this part of my speech. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin,
but by the content of their character. I practically know the speech by heart. It made you super famous. You were named Time Magazine's Man of the Year, and the following year, you won the Nobel Peace Prize.
Yes, and the March on Washington led the government to pass the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which made segregation illegal in the United States. After that, I focused on international peace and economic justice. I spoke out about the Vietnam War and worked with the Poor People's Campaign, a coalition of poor Americans advocating for economic change. My final fight for justice came in 1968 when I traveled to Memphis, Tennessee, to march with sanitation workers striking for better pay. Perhaps you could share the rest of the story without me?
Of course, Dr. King. Thank you for joining us. We'll let you return to history now.
Remember the power of peaceful protest. Goodbye.
On April 4th, 1968, during that trip to Memphis, Dr. King stepped out onto the balcony of his hotel. Tragically, he was assassinated by a man who supported segregation. Dr. King was only 39 years old when he died, but he had already accomplished so many things in his fight for civil rights. Today, his dream of equality for all people lives on, both in his famous speeches and in civil rights movements around the world. Thank you for joining me. I'll be back soon to interview another superstar from the past.